Hi, I'm Charles Galda, your host for Vision New England's Church in Action program. This week, I'm talking with Pastor Adam DePasquale. Adam is one of the lead pastors at Walnut Hill Community Church in Greater Danbury, Greater Waterbury, Connecticut. Adam, thanks for being with us.
Hey, it's great to be here with Charles. Thanks for inviting me.
So before we dig in, I think there's a lot we want to try and cover today. Before we dig in, could you maybe kind of share a little bit more about yourself than I did? Remind people, who are you? How'd you get to be at Walnut Hill? Stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, born and raised here in Connecticut, so I love that. And, I was born into a family where my parents were Catholic, DePasquale, it's a good Italian last name, nominal Catholic. And so when my dad was in his early 30s, he went through kind of a personal crisis in his life that brought him to rock bottom. And I share that to say he ended up at a business meeting. In the midst of the business meeting, a man shared his faith with my dad, and my dad gave his life to Jesus. And my dad surrendered to the Lord, and his life started to change. He became like an overnight evangelist. And so my mom gave her life to the Lord, then my older brother, then myself, my younger brother, and it just spread throughout our family. But I share that with you to say this, that was an incredible, important moment in my family's life. It changed the trajectory of our legacy, of our family. And my dad said, we need to find a church that preaches from the Bible. And so we had tried one out, but ultimately we found Walnut Hill Community Church, where I am today. It was called Grace Community Church at that time. So I actually had the privilege of growing up through the children's ministry and the youth ministry, and which was incredible. I went off to college, never thinking I'd come back necessarily to Connecticut. I was down in Nashville doing music and arranging and producing those kinds of things. And my wife and I started attending a church that was going through what I would call like a renewal. That's when God's people fall in love with the Lord all over again. And we found ourselves catching fire for the Lord. Within a short period of time, we started saying, I think the Lord's calling us to transition out of Nashville. We looked at going to the West Coast, didn't feel peace, looked at coming to New York City, didn't feel peace. So we said, what if we go back to Connecticut for 6 months? That was the plan. And we came back to Connecticut, said, let's check out our home church. And things had really changed. They had started a young adult service. We went to the service, and we felt that same spirit of revival that we felt at our other church in Nashville. We became super volunteers pretty quickly. And within a period of time, the church said, hey, would you come on staff here at Walnut Hill? So that was, believe it or not, like 21, 22 years ago, which is incredible.
So you're in 22 years of your 6-month return to Connecticut.
That's right. Yeah. It's funny how that happens, right?
And you and I was thinking about it before we started. You and I have known each other for going on 20 years now.
Yeah.
Amazing. And so tell folks a little bit more about Walnut Hill.
Yeah, absolutely. So my family started to attend the church in 1983. The church started in 1982. There was a small group of families who had been traveling to Black Rock Church. Many of you know that name, great church right nearby. But they were traveling about 45 minutes to Black Rock. And, when you're going 45 minutes to a church, it's hard to get involved in the middle of the week. Maybe your kids, if you have kids, it's hard to get involved. So this group of folks said to Black Rock's leadership, would you support us launching something similar in the greater Danbury area? And really what they were looking for was a church that preached the Bible on Sundays, right? A church that was welcoming to everyone. A church that would invest in the future generations, kids and youth, and one that prioritized local outreach and global outreach. And so that's how they started off. And that was, back in 1982. Amazingly, we started in an elementary school, as so often happens. Actually, we started in a hotel, outgrew the hotel, went to an elementary school, then to a high school, then to a middle school. Finally, we built our first building like 14 years after starting, had 2 building renovations as the Lord just, blessed us. And then we went multi-site back in 2010. And we really had this vision of continuing to grow, but by bringing new people to know the Lord. And so now we have 4 campuses. One of them is in Waterbury, Connecticut, so more of an urban setting. In New Milford, more of a rural setting. In Derby, Connecticut, and the greater Danbury area. So it's really a cool context and very diverse.
And you can tell I'm drinking out of one of my mugs related to one of those building projects.
That's awesome.
Hey, so Adam, we're all on a spiritual journey. You've been on a kind of mixed historical spiritual journey, all intertwined together. And so, how did that start?
Yeah, good question. Um, what's interesting? I was contemplating this question. So I was raised in a home that was built in 1830. Now, for New England standards, it's not very old. But growing up, there was something about the history of the house. I think that was intriguing to me. And then in Connecticut, literally in our town, there are Revolutionary War sites that you go and visit. So I think I always had a little bit of an interest in finding these locations. Um, but when I was in Nashville, the pastor at our church was from Connecticut, strangely enough, and he would often tell stories of the Great Awakening. And these were stories that I wasn't all that familiar with. So when we came back to Connecticut, and we would be in these prayer meetings, praying for the Lord to do something new in Connecticut and in New England, we would often start to talk about these revival stories. And then one day we were having a church picnic at one of the members of our church, and they're up in, let's say, Northwest Connecticut, more of a rural area, hundreds of acres. And we would often go there to do our baptism services. And this was like familiar ground for us all. And he shared that on his property was the birth site of Charles Finney, the great evangelist from the Second Great Awakening. And so I was like, wow, really? And so we went on a pilgrimage through, the woods of Connecticut to find this original birth site. And there's actually a memorial there that was put there by Oberlin College, where Charles Finney ultimately was at. And it's this amazing site. And so I think after I visited that location, I kind of got a little bit of this new calling upon me to find these locations. So I made a Google map, and I now have something like 60 different locations across New England where significant revival and spiritual historical events have taken place in New England. And I just love adding to it. I love visiting sites. It's become like a hobby for me, I guess.
And so, how many have you been to, would you say, at this point?
Oh, I'm usually, they only go on my map if I visited them personally.
So after you've gone, not after you just learned about, okay. So you've been to 60 or 70. And I
sure.
remember you've taken some kind of, I don't want to use the word tour, I don't know what else to use, but groups to some of these sites too.
That's right. Yeah, we brought a youth group, we brought a young adult group, and we did a group of adults on kind of a trail, a New England revival trail, which is really fun. Yeah.
Fascinating. And so who are some of the players? What time frame are we talking about? And who are some of the players back then?
Yeah, I mean, really all time periods. I mean, I go all the way back, we call it the Jonathan Edwards Trail. Many sites related to him. Maybe we chat about that today. George Whitfield Trail. That's a fascinating trail to follow in his footsteps, where he went day by day. Many of you know George Whitfield actually has an autobiography, and he journals like sometimes on a daily basis what happened in that day, where he was. And so it's fun to read about it and fun to visit the sites. And then you get sites like there's two sites in Connecticut where they were huge summer Methodist revival camps. You're talking about tens of thousands of people would drive out or come out in trains and meet in the woods, and they'd have campsites, and you can go and visit these places now. They're either gone or they're like homes that are now kind of run down. But there's so many sites like that. Famous sites where certain sermons were preached, or things like that. So it's really fun.
Well, do you know? You just made me think of this. Do you know the name Gypsy Smith?
Yeah.
And so I never heard of Gypsy Smith until I went to look at some of Vision New England's papers at Gordon Conwell. We donated our paper there years ago. And we did Dwight Moody stuff. We did Billy Sunday stuff. We did something with Gypsy Smith, and the local papers reported 300,000 people heard the gospel for week or weeks that he was preaching in Boston. And the same thing, people came from miles and miles around. Companies like packed up trucks of employees and brought them there. And so there are these revival things are really quite significant. And so who do you think is the most interesting character in
I don't know if I could pick a favorite, but I would say, like, for instance, like on a Jonathan Edwards Trail, you can visit where he was born and he grew up, South Windsor, Connecticut, the church that he attended. His dad was the pastor. The woods where he would go out and he writes, and to pray in the woods, just wanting to meet with the Lord at like the age of 14. There's a great story of a small revival that took place in his country church at age 14 that he remembers, which you have to believe definitely made an impression for him as he got older.
Yeah.
Then you can follow Jonathan Edwards down to when he went to Yale, which was actually in Wethersfield at that time. And if you've been to Wethersfield, you know the first church, which dates back, it's one of the oldest churches in the country, actually. George Washington worshiped there. John Adams stopped by one time. And you can sit there in that church and just imagine the young Jonathan Edwards, learning about faith and all these different things. Probably one of the things I love about Jonathan Edwards is that ultimately he was invited by his grandfather to be what I would call a resident or an intern up in the second largest church in New England at the time, Northampton. This would have been like a mega church at that time. And so here he is in his early 20s, and he was, partnering with his grandfather doing ministry, which I think is pretty remarkable. There's an earthquake that happens in, that time period, and there's a coming back to the Lord. And then his grandfather dies, and the church looks at Jonathan Edwards and votes him in as pastor. Here he is in his mid-20s, becoming the senior pastor of one of the largest churches in New England. And it's stories like that I love to uncover and I love to ponder, because I think we can learn something about revival as we do that. For instance, I think young people are essential to any move of God. And I think oftentimes we don't give young people the responsibility or the opportunities that maybe we should. We know that when people are young, they don't have it all together, right? I didn't. But something about the vitality, the excitement, the energy, it's incredibly inspiring, right? So there's an example of something I think you learn.
When you say, I think young people, you're not saying that just that, hey, that's your opinion. You've actually researched all this stuff and you've seen the pattern over and over again, right?
Well, think about this. George Whitefield, right? George Whitefield, right around 21 years old when he breaks out as an amazing preacher in England, thousands of people coming out to hear him, 21. When he comes to New England for the first time, he's in his early 20s, and tens of thousands of people would come out to hear him speak. Yeah. So you got to look at that. I mean, that's an act of God, right? We know that. Yeah. But there's something about, inviting young people into ministry and actually saying, go for it, Yeah. So.
Now, you mentioned Northampton with Jonathan Edwards, because that becomes that's a big site in the First Great Awakening. That becomes a big site in the Third Great Awakening, doesn't it? Because isn't that where Moody winds up?
Yeah, north of there. That's right. Yeah. And it actually forms what they would call kind of like an evangelical triangle with the Haystack Revival up there in the West. And yeah, amazing things happen there in Western Massachusetts.
What's the Haystack Revival?
Well, that's what came out of the college up there. And it was young people praying, and ultimately became like one of the first mission movements that came from college students praying together. Yeah.
And so okay, so we've talked about Edwards. And what's going on with Whitefield during this time? Or he's a little bit later, if I remember right.
But you're right, they overlap. So this is what's really fun. So we come into the early 1730s. Jonathan Edwards' grandfather has now passed away. Jonathan's got the burden of ministry, the burden of leadership. And he's really discouraged because he sees what's happening in Northampton, similar to what was happening at Yale College at the time. And, the young people are out of control. And so he's praying about it. But what happens is someone actually passes away, a young person, and the whole town is startled by this. And Jonathan Edwards preaches this sermon that is so powerful and just strikes people. And it kind of makes them, really consider their lives. And so prayer meetings begin. And all of a sudden, like an awakening before the First Awakening occurs. It's in the 1730s, known as the Northampton Awakening. It's like a precursor to the First Great Awakening. And all these great things happen. People who would never come to the Lord come to the Lord. And Jonathan Edwards decides to actually write all this down as almost like a manual on how to help facilitate a revival and partner with God. Well, meanwhile, just later in the 1730s, George Whitefield is in England. His ministry is getting going. And he gets a hold of this book that Jonathan Edwards wrote about what happened in New England. And he gets so encouraged by this. So when he comes over to the U.S., one of the first things he wants to do is to meet with Jonathan Edwards. So in his visit to New England after being in Boston, he goes out to Northampton. He actually stays at Jonathan Edwards' home. So here he is, and he's in his early 20s. Jonathan Edwards is now in his late 30s, mid to late 30s. And you can get this idea of Jonathan Edwards. He's learned a little bit. He's gained some experience, and yet he can feed into the young George Whitefield. And you can actually visit where Jonathan Edwards' home used to be. It's now another church. But I walked the block around that church and just imagined, what was it like when George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards got in the same home and they had time together. George Whitefield writes about this in his autobiography and talks about how impressed he was by his Jonathan Edwards' family's life and how he really desired a family of his own. But that's the kind of fun thing you find. And then George Whitefield heads out from Northampton, and he goes on this great revival kind of tour through Connecticut, down the Connecticut River Valley. And unlike today when we do tours where you have a concert T-shirt and you plan it out, 26 dates, George Whitefield really went by the leading of the Spirit. So he would go to a town, he would preach, and then he would say, I feel like the Lord's calling us to go here. And then he would go there. Sometimes he would take a hard left turn and go from Connecticut into Rhode Island and then come back. I mean, he was definitely really following the Spirit's lead there. Yeah. But whenever he went to a place, no one knew he was coming. And as soon as they heard he was coming, they would stop working. The plows would stop, the stores would close, and people would rush out to the green. There's one story of a person writing that just dust filled the air, sounds of like thunder. It was horses all running towards the same location because George Whitefield was in town. That's the kind of thing that was happening. It was incredible.
And there's an element. So, we have this idea sometimes that, well, in the early days of the country, everyone's a Christian. And if that were true, you couldn't have revivals. There wouldn't be a point to them. And so it's demonstrably not true. And because we have these histories of awakenings, and people are coming out, some of those people, I think, but you tell me, are coming out of curiosity, just like they would go to Jesus out of curiosity. Yeah. We've heard of this guy. Let's go see what's going on. But there's also people saying, don't come here.
Yeah. And that's actually really important to say that because, George Whitefield most often would preach on town greens in New England. And we know town greens, they'd have multiple churches on it. Mm-hmm. Well, one issue was a space issue. Yeah. But more than that, to your point, these churches didn't want him preaching in there. They disagreed with him. So here he was, opposition coming at him. And I think so often we learn he innovates. He's like, all right, we're going to do it out here on the town green. And so there's something about that opposition that actually brought about innovation, which I think we could learn from today for sure.
Because when we use the term evangelical, we're talking theologically, of course, because it's taken on some other meanings. But evangelicals were looked down upon that back then, right? It was this emotional thing that we didn't like. It wasn't proper, right? So it was really a threat. And then at some point you have the whole Unitarian movement going on, but I think that's probably second or third Great Awakening. Am I right?
Yeah. I would say this. There was theology definitely caused some issues in the church during the Great First Awakening. And, as so often happens, it's not that someone's purely right and someone's purely wrong. It's letting go of presumptions. It's learning to, come together as the body of Christ and put aside differences as more important than minor theological differences, right? Now, I'm not trying to undermine some of the theological discussions they were having, but it's interesting that theology was an issue at that time.
And it's interesting because when you connect Edwards to Whitefield, of course, Whitefield and Wesley are well known to each other, right? I don't know how much they work together, but they're both well known to each other and collaborated some. And of course, Wesley has a big influence on Wilberforce, if I remember my history right. And of course, Wilberforce is the one who's driving the end of the slave trade, which is fascinating.
Yeah, really is. Really is.
And so we've shared some stuff too that, so out of this Great Awakening, there's this focus on individual liberty in Christ that takes on a bigger political meaning too, of the argument that basically people have argued you can't get to the revolution without the Great Awakening.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah. No, there was a lot going on. I mean, even leading to the Great Awakening, So go back to the Pilgrims. I know it sounds crazy. Go back to the Pilgrims, 1620, right? And you had a group of people who were passionate about the Lord. Now, there's a uniqueness to their faith. We know that in terms of the Puritan way. But the next generation coming out of the Pilgrims, as so often happens, struggled with their faith to keep up the same sort of vitality that the early Pilgrims did. And so by the time you get to, early 1700s, mid 1700s, there's desperate need for a revival because there's religion around, but there's not this relationship with Jesus. There's churches around because, as you know, in order to have a town in Connecticut, parts of Massachusetts, you needed a church. It was the center of the town. So religion was part of the context, but not the faith in the Lord in the way that we know it today. So from that place of awakening, you had all of a sudden people from different backgrounds and religious backgrounds coming together. And so it kind of broke through some of the barriers that had existed, that had grown in terms of different denominations. Revival broke through that, which then I think ultimately, to your point, brought about this freedom, this sense of freedom that led to the revolution. It was really interesting.
And then the same thing is true with the Second Great Awakening, because it gets so focused on we need to bring justice to this world, and that means slavery can't be here, and you probably don't get to the Civil War absent the Second Great Awakening.
Yeah.
And so the Great Awakenings that are so connected to New England change the world, because they don't just change the colonies or the states, or they change the world, which just shows the power of even these in the grand scheme of things, small movements, but from a church perspective, really big movements of God. They're earth shattering.
Yeah. Yeah. And so many of them happened right here in New England, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, the First Great Awakening, you correct me if I'm missing my history. First Great Awakening starts in New England.
Yeah.
Second one, I think, starts in New York, but then hits New England early and just blows out from New England all over the colonies. And I think the third one is also very early in New England, if not just starting here. Am I right?
Yeah, and you're talking about Moody particularly in that.
That age. And actually Vision New England is founded out of the Third Great Awakening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's another great example. You've obviously, we've met together before at the Moody site up there in Massachusetts, and you go there and these just amazing buildings that were schools for boys and girls, really to raise up the next generation. But all of those buildings were made with the money that Moody brought in from his ministry, which was around the world. And so, yeah, it's amazing. It's just the locations you can visit are really amazing.
Yeah. And some of them are quite out in the middle of nowhere today.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what makes it fun to visit them.
Yeah.
I think I'd say this, like studying spiritual history is great because it touches the mind, the heart, and the spirit. That's what I like to say. It touches the mind in that when you have the context to your region in terms of understanding what happens spiritually, it helps you understand why we do the things we do, why there are these things that just would be strange to foreigners. Like I'll give you an example, like town greens. Why are there churches on town greens, particularly in Connecticut, Massachusetts, right? And the answer to that is because you needed a church in order to start a town, right? And then as that started changing, the churches were built on the green. But, knowing that is really helpful. So definitely studying history is great for context, but then it touches what I would say the heart. And what I mean by that is when you stand, like, for instance, on the green where George Whitefield preached and you see how huge it was, it kind of produces in you a certain desire to be bold, like, wow, Lord, what if, could I have that kind of boldness, or could I have that kind of perseverance? There's a story where George Whitefield is going from one location to preach at another, and he has this terrible horse accident where he falls off and he's like badly injured. He gets up, gets back on the horse, and he preaches the same night. And so, studying that, you learn, wow, perseverance is necessary, right? We know that anyway. And then I would say, mind, heart, spirit, because when you go to these locations and you actually take the time, it's almost like a theology of place. Now, I'm not super mystical, but when you go to a place and you realize that here in this location, the Lord just did a great work, a few hundred years ago, it leads you to pray. And sometimes my prayers will simply be, Lord, do it again. Other times it may be, Lord, here I am, use me whatever way you want. And that leads to a fresh encounter with God. So when you go to these locations, what starts as something that's maybe intellectual, moves to something that touches your heart, and then moves to your spirit as you say, Lord, here I am, would you do it again? And you intercede for the town.
Tune in next week at this time to hear the second part of this interview with Adam DePasquale of Walnut Hill Community Church. Hey, this is Charles Galda, and I'm excited to tell you about Vision New England's annual Leading Together gathering. It's May 6th and 7th at Gordon College, and it's open to anyone who leads a ministry in New England. We'll spend a day focused on disciple-making pathways and cultures and how you build them. We'll, over the course of the 2 days, also have a prayer meeting. We'll have workshops on managing change in a church context, on disability ministry, creative funding models, spiritual oppression, and a lot more, with plenty of time to connect with other people, build relationships, and build unity. Hope to see you there. You can register at visionnewengland.org. This program is created by Vision New England, which accelerates evangelism by helping the church work in unity to make disciples, do justice, and share Jesus, so New England will be transformed by the love of Jesus. You can find additional resources and support our mission at visionnewengland.org. We want to thank our friends at World Vision, who are celebrating 75 years of God's faithfulness and trusting Him with a worldwide vision to end extreme poverty for children everywhere. Join us next Sunday at 2 p.m. on Life Changing Radio. Thank you and God bless you.